Chapter 76. Despite how little your screw-up seems to matter after everything was done and finished, you still vouch to yourself that you would do better in the future. For you honestly didn't believe that you could live with a second failure of such magnitude, as you weren't blind to how annoyingly soft you've become when you look back at how torn you were over fixing your mistakes. But while you would have to swiftly improve, the same was true for your companion, as he didn't fail any less by not stripping himself of his cloak once he saw that it was of no help in neither the reach nor the veil. It was a surprise that so few people on your journey actually respected the strength behind the golden lion that adorns the banners, tents, and cloaks of House Lannister each time you look back on all the ambushes. You suppose that it was just one of those things that no one realizes till long after the fact, but as a trained professional when it comes to moving swiftly and silently, you really should have seen that cloak for the massive problem it was long before you could have stumbled across the boy. You probably overlooked the whole issue since all thoughts of moving stealthily had been so thoroughly wrecked by your companion's massive frame and his tendency to clad himself in deep red by other far more disgusting means. But a good excuse is still just that, an excuse, and so you stripped your companion of all red besides his gambesinas that couldn't really be replaced and might still have some use beyond simply keeping him alive. Yes, some kind of tall tale of how the gambesine was actually dyed by the blood of a few dozen unlucky clansmen would certainly be outlandish and boastful enough to make up for some of his social shortcomings, wouldn't it? Sigh, you were honestly not sure how good you could work around his lack of speech, but having him around if stealth should fail you, would most certainly be worth the effort of dragging him along, especially if you consider how many knights would stand between you and the good Lord Aaron. Your companion for his part took the loss of his cloak with a surprising amount of dignity, though you could tell that he most certainly wasn't happy about the change, as you could hear how his footsteps became even more brisk and heavier. But looking back on it, it was actually kind of adorable how much attachment he showed to his blood-soaked treasure of a cloak when he stashed the thing away. Though you knew better than to say anything about it as you had to make similar sacrifices of comfort in the past where a mission or two required you to change your equipment spontaneously. Not to mention that you didn't even know anything about the story behind the gear and thus his bond with it, beyond the fact that all the Black Knights you saw wore the same equipment. Leaving things as they were wasn't optimal, but you could tell that your companion wasn't safe to be around as he was forging a path through the forest as if he was going to flatten the first potential enemy he would stumble across. And said enemy would probably be followed by the second and the third till he finally finds a moment of clarity to refocus on your mission once more. Which was all things considered a surprisingly boyish reaction you honestly hadn't anticipated, as he didn't feel like the kind of person that would seethe with such anger over something so minor. But seeing as you have no way to actually gauge his reactions while he's silently hiding his expressions under that armor of his, there's very little you could do to really get through to him even if you were willing to risk it. Sometimes this companion of yours really feels more like a force of nature rather than a proper human being, with how he's either completely indifferent while he pursues his orders with just a sprinkle of personality hidden under all the steel, only for him to become completely unstable and nearly unstoppable once he actually gets even a tiny bit invested, as if he was more spirit than man, and that change in personality you could observe before you was more than a bit disconcerting. It was by now pretty normal for you to simply wait till he's finished when he's immersing himself in bloodshed, as you wouldn't be able to stop him anyway, but those spouts of bloodlust are normally not all that malicious. That neutral, somewhat bestial kind of bloodlust is why you sometimes see him more as a monster or perhaps a wolf rather than the knight that he so obviously tries to be. But the kind of anger he is currently showing doesn't have so much as a shred of that neutral kind of bloodlust you were used to in it. It's like he's actually holding genuine love for his equipment under all that steel as if the blood-soaked thing was an actual treasure. Thinking about it, there's a pretty good chance that he was truly some kind of spirit if you consider that you never actually saw your companion eat or sleep on your journey. And while you could somewhat understand that most people wouldn't like to sleep or eat in the presence of an assassin, no matter how small, that didn't really sound like the monster that caught you all those months ago. It wasn't impossible that he did so once you've fallen asleep, but when you think about his massive height in combination with the strength to throw around fully loaded wagons, that didn't sound right. And then there was the fact that your master had claimed that he had worked together with spirits before. It doesn't sound all that unbelievable anymore. It might even be fun now that you think about it. Say, would you tell me if you were actually some kind of spirit, you trusty old companion of mine? Well? Come now, don't just stand there silently, you big old steely mute. You even quelled your anger when I asked you this innocent little question of mine, so no excuses. Could it be that spirits can't actually talk, and that's why you're still tongue-tied? Okay then, the giant black spirit in the forest says nothing. I knew it. Chapter 77. You were right, it was indeed quite entertaining to mess with him like this, though you weren't really sure how to proceed now that you knew this little snippet of information about your companion, as it, everything considered, didn't actually change all that much when it came to your interactions with him. For the greatest and pretty much only changes you managed to find since you started talking with him were that he started to shift more and more frequently between his passive and wolf-like side, and that he seems a bit more spirited, pun intended, while he moved, so nothing all that interesting. Well, there was strictly speaking also a change when it came to the direction he was so energetically marching towards a few days later, but that didn't seem all that noteworthy, all things considered. For while they had all the wealth one could ever want, the Lannisters, like pretty much everyone else, didn't actually possess accurate maps of the Vale as far as you knew. And that lack of information was one of the main reasons for why travel through the Vale was so ridiculously bothersome, if you ignore the constant ambushes. For once the planned path ahead becomes unviable, there was nothing one could do but change direction, as there was quite simply no use in arguing with a mountain chain or two. You weren't all that sure where you were going, as your companion had silently and so naturally without clear reason taken the lead of your little party. But you weren't really that concerned about the sudden change in direction, as you knew that he wouldn't march right into the camp of one of the Arryn or Mountain clan hosts that were active in the region without some pretty good reason. In times like these you really wished that your companion could answer to more than simple yes and no questions while you were on the move, but life was life, you supposed. You know, you big companion of mine, it would be really awesome if you could bother to give me some proper warning the next time you decide to march right up to the gate of a massive and probably hostile camp. Yeah, I can see that you just forgot to do it. That's why I'm still talking to you without any bitterness or resentment, but I still want to remind you that I'm mortal and all that. I absolutely don't want to die because you forgot that fact and did something that takes plate armor to survive. You can understand that much, right? Good. So despite how the camp looked from afar, those guys are clearly not Knights of the Vale now that I can see them up close. That being the case, did you lead us here expecting to find a host of the Arryns, or did you predict that we would actually find those clansmen here? Ah yes, apologies. Did you try to meet up with the knights that should be somewhere in the ground nearby, or with that host of the mountain clans, positive for the former and negative for the latter? Huh, so does that mean I was right about that connection I felt between the mountain clans and the Lannisters? Come on, don't look at me like that. Everyone who makes a living from working in the shadows would pick up on the fact that those clans changed way too much in terms of strength for it to be natural. Fine, I suppose our little journey was really what gave me that feeling, but it's genuinely not that hard to figure out once you realize that House Lannister is actively sending more of its agents into the Vale instead of using them to hunt down those thousands of rebels in the Reach. Uck, you're such a stickler, but sure, the Westerlands, those thousands of rebels in the Westerlands, happy now? Great, so what do you need from those brutes that you specifically sought them out? That's not really something that I can turn into a yes or no question right now, so just tell me if I need to do anything here, whatever we're here for. Awesome, then I will leave it to you, and thanks for the talk, I guess. Well, you certainly had more fruitful conversations throughout your life, but knowing that you didn't have to do anything, and that he had apparently already planned to come here at least a few days beforehand, was good enough for the moment. For you were never really fond of any idea that involved fighting through the main entrance of just about anything, as that just didn't blend well with your abilities. Sigh, that he actually forgot about your mortality was more than a bit bothersome, but you supposed that you should probably focus on the current situation even if he had told you that you didn't need to do anything. Thinking back on it, you couldn't help but wonder how he planned to get those clansmen to open the gate of the camp if he didn't have your help, or the ability to talk. Sigh, no. If you're completely honest with yourself, you pretty much already knew what was going to happen if you consider his surprise and the fact that you both were already standing some 25 meters away from the gate. Yeah, there were really only a few select things that this monster of a companion would never need any help with, and while you think that you can already hear the first impact of his hammer on the gate, It seems like House Lannister didn't care all that much about its connections with the mountain clans if they were willing to go out of their way to get rid of them once they get truly invested into something of actual importance. And while you and your companion took care of dozens upon dozens of mountain clan raiding parties since you entered the Vale, you didn't expect that the Lannisters were willing to just drop this puppet of theirs this suddenly. Thus, you found yourself with thoughts of nigh absolute confusion about their motives as more and more heavily armored clansmen stormed out of the now ruined gate, and you could only think about how nothing of this made any sense to you as half a dozen of these bastards were coming for you. Chapter 78. Considering your companion's tendency to solve problems with copious amounts of violence, you probably should have been prepared for a situation like this one to eventually happen, but knowing that things like this could transpire just wasn't the same as genuinely believing that something would actually happen. For while this companion of yours has already shown you his nigh endless potential when it came to ending lives, that never meant that he would actually rely on brute force to carry the day as long as there were still other options. You understood that your companion enjoyed violence far too much for his own good, but it didn't really make any sense to you that he would ignore his thus far pretty clear better judgment and actually go out of his way to die through the hands of his master's allies. There would have been plenty of other options if he truly sought the destruction of this massive if somewhat damaged camp, and it wasn't like you weren't willing to help him out if it was truly necessary. But literally none of these tactics you had come up with on the spot would have employed his abilities like this, simply because you were absolutely sure that the number of the camp's defenders far exceeded 2,000. And these very same options that you were still thinking about while you dealt with your assailants one by one would have come with a guaranteed success if the two of you had worked together to pull them off. You were sure of it till now, but while none of this was truly making sense to you, that didn't mean that your companion had suddenly gone insane. No, it was a decent bit more likely that this haste of his was actually well-founded, as you silently observed a suspiciously large amount of both magpies and pigeons in the sky. You supposed that it made sense that the mountain clans would care very little for what birds they used to deliver their messages, but even so, weren't 3 to 4 dozen of them a bit too much just to request some reinforcements? Yes, everything considered, there really shouldn't be a reason for them to send that many outgoing messages with how little they actually knew about the monster you called your companion. But even more concerning was that you had really no idea how many of those birds you had missed while you dealt with your assailants, and that fact was becoming more and more bothersome the longer you thought about it. The most sound conclusion you could draw from all you've seen so far was a rather simple one, namely that this wasn't just one of the many hosts that the mountain clans have sent against the errands. No, this host was far too impressively equipped even if they had plundered the entire camp twice over. And then there was the matter of what could only be called a suspicious amount of means to communicate for a tribal host. Which meant that this host was an actual army that exceeded the standards most houses of the 7 kingdoms could meet quite a few times over, or in other words, this was if you had to guess the very host the Lannisters had created to start this entire madness off. That was actually quite good. In fact, the paths that taking this camp would open up were nigh endless if your companion had been given enough authority by the Lannisters to move forward with his slaughter. Who knows, mayhaps these were the very possibilities that had motivated this companion of yours to seek out this treasure trove of a camp in the first place. You couldn't be entirely sure till you actually managed to ask him about it at length, but even without knowing the exact details of the situation, your mission just got a whole lot more simple. But that being said, the sight and sounds this night of yours was creating couldn't be stomached easily, despite how entrancing it was to see the spirit's martial prowess from behind the safety of your own little pile of corpses. For the first few moments in which you were occupied with your own little problems, you honestly couldn't bring yourself to believe that your companion had genuinely planned to take on the entire camp all on his own, so you had no idea what you should expect. But the moment you actually managed to get a properly look at your companion as he was still fighting some 2 meters before the gate, you just supposed that you should really thank the gods that you never dared that spirit to do anything as he was still happily laying into those dark parodies of nights. You didn't really know what to do with yourself as you continued to watch as another swing of his hammer sent 2 of the mountain knights, as you had decided to call them, into the line of knights to his left. He had told you that your help wouldn't be needed, and it most certainly didn't look like he had been lying. But you still found yourself quite troubled when they actually managed to fully encircle him with half a dozen ranks of heavy knights. The option to support him was of course still there as the clansmen were all enticingly bunched up, and you doubted that your companion needed to breathe, but without knowing for sure that he didn't, you just couldn't do so in good faith. Sigh. You were honestly not sure what to think of this madness you had the pleasure of seeing as that monster of a spirit just continued swinging that hammer of his with ever-increasing strength and speed as if it was nothing. Yet the more you watched his hammer move, the more bothersome it became as he continued to abuse his greater reach and strength while he trusted that massive armor of his to take all blows the clansman could get in. And things only got worse for them from there, as your companion swiftly began to change the intensity of his attacks as he slowly began to carefully move with his swings. Yet while some of these fools had apparently deluded themselves into thinking that they were finally getting him tired, you knew better, for you had seen that very same change before. And the reason for why that was as terrible as it was quickly became apparent, as the struggle between the host of the false knights and the monster below the gate was suddenly interrupted. For said monster had just introduced one of the most spine-chilling sounds you've ever heard to the memories of everyone present, as your companion's sadistic and wolf-like side had happily taken him over. Chapter 79. You knew of course that this change in personality had been a positive one if you considered that the current situation with the countless false knights had been getting pretty bad in terms of dealing with them swiftly before their reinforcements could manage to join the battle. For while your dark companion had simply continued his tireless slaughter through their ranks, there was no denying the fact that these very same ranks of false knights were surprisingly still succeeding in slowing down his progress to absolutely minuscule gains. But seeing as the price of that success made sure that no one had taken the time to turn around and recognize said lack of progress for the success it was, you guessed that it wasn't too surprising that his darker side decided to speed things up a little more. For once the false knights would have realized just how close they were to grasping victory as long as they could manage to bring in their fellow clansmen faster than your companion could kill them. Any and all chances of actually breaking them would have simply slipped from your companion's grasp. And that for quite obvious reasons wouldn't do if you considered that even such a powerful spirit would eventually be felled if they brought in more and more weapons with superior range and penetration ability. Thus, what you could only call the second personality of your companion had so quickly taken over as everything that would be needed to avoid such a disaster was to break them before they received any reinforcements at all. Therefore the change in personality was actually quite good for your chances of survival. But seeing as that nightmarish noise just continued to dig itself further into your mind the longer you listened, there was naturally no way for you to appreciate the fact as it meant that you would have to sleep with that noise in the back of your mind tonight. And even though you weren't all that vulnerable to that kind of stuff, that the darker side of your companion was apparently never all that far away even while he watched over you in your sleep certainly wouldn't make for what you would call a pleasant night. The sound itself, while created by astonishingly simple means, was hard to properly describe, but seeing as you had currently little to do beyond observing the now deathly silent battlefield and the creation of said sound, you supposed that you should get through this stuff as soon as possible to get it out of your head. For even if everything were to go perfectly from here, the entire region would still crawl with the numberless troops of the mountain clans for who knows how many days of travel, and you had absolutely no interest of going through all that while being sleep-deprived. But while you thought about these things, your giant black companion made you shiver once more as he slowed his slaughter a second time to step on another one of the pitiful fallen knights, which naturally replicated the nightmarish sound once more. There were few sounds that you could even imagine would be worse than what this monster you called your companion had come up with, and it seemed that your enemies agreed with this sentiment of yours, as they once more cringed back from the monster in black despite their still massive advantage in numbers. It could best be described by saying that everything starts with a groan, namely the groan of the wounded knight that was about to be crushed, followed by the sound of the knight's breaking ribs and naturally his screams, and that was just the harmless part that could be found on any battlefield. What followed the initial breaking of the ribs was of course the crisp sounds of the now bending armor, together with the soft noise created by the knight's organs being torn and mashed. And once more quite naturally, the sound of the knight's screams, though now far less clear and much deeper as the poor knight continued to nearly drown in his own blood. But that didn't stop your still corrupted companion, so there was yet more in store for his screaming victim, as the armor of the false knight continued to struggle and bend under his massive boot. And with pretty much nowhere else to go, the previously broken ribs joined by the knight's now vulnerable spine found themselves once more under the less than gentle treatment of your companion's boot. Thus, while the knight lost the ability to scream, Your companion made sure to compensate for the change by filling the surroundings with the last now much harsher sound of breaking bones once more. You understood that your companion was faster than those knights by quite the good margin, but you honestly couldn't understand why these absolute fools still hadn't split up and fled if they knew that they could be that very same knight if they fell to the ground still living. Especially with how all of this suffering was cramped and condensed into a single 3 to 4 second long sound of pure and ungodly agony, it should have been more than clear that sticking around for just another second was one hell of a stupid decision. But you soon managed to understand their reasoning as you looked through the opened gate and saw what lay beyond while you watched how your companion was going through his 407th mountain night of the day. The opposite gate had been barricaded with a giant pile of stone and wood. It seemed a bit like life was really out for them if they had just finished the groundwork to properly fortify the camp against the heavy cavalry that are the Knights of the Vale, on top of encountering your companion in the same week. But at least that part of it was the funny and distracting kind of misfortune. It was actually quite amusing that their situation would have been so unbelievably easier if they hadn't decided to wear those armors. Now all they could do was hold the walls and fight your companion, as they lacked the mobility to properly scout the surrounding land for further enemies. You supposed that you could still help your companion if you searched the woods for those few remaining scouts that might have dared to leave behind their loot to do what was necessary. There was still the small problem concerning your lack of information on how many scouts had actually sneaked out, but you would do pretty much anything if it meant that you could get away from your companion while he was this traumatizing. And who knows, mayhaps you could even manage to find some useful information on these scouts if they were competent enough to accept the decently sized risk of losing their loot over risking their lives against your companion. Chapter 80. The woods naturally didn't contain any reinforcements waiting in concealed ambush positions, but as you considered how many troops could be squeezed into a single abandoned mine or under all those tiny natural bridges you had come across, it actually made sense that your hunt had been going as great as it did. Few things could actually worsen the situation for the host of the mountain clans now that your companion's personality had changed, but a little bit of false information could always manage to worsen a situation, no matter how dear it already was. Thus, the 4 dozen or so scouts you had seen glimpses of were understandably working overtime to check and double-check each and every crevice in the region that they knew was large enough to hide a dozen men. And you could honestly only thank them for making your work that much easier, as you weren't entirely sure how you could have gotten as many as you did if they had taken the time to scout as proper parties instead of the smaller teams you had come across. You were actually having a good time despite the amount of effort you had to put into remaining hidden from the scouting force at large, as the forests of the Vale turned out to be surprisingly soothing now that you could work at your own pace as no one tried to kill you. Sigh. You knew of course that this would most assuredly change once the scouts discovered the bodies or managed to spot you as you buried your blades into a team of their friends, but the quiet peace of the woods was genuinely delightful while it lasted. There wasn't all that much you actually needed to do, as discovering the remains of several scout teams should be more than enough to convince them that someone in these woods wasn't all that fond of being found. They would naturally still try to figure out what the host would have to deal with in terms of numbers, but you were sure that it would be more than enough to make sure that the troops that were still defending the walls wouldn't be redeployed anytime soon. Though from what you had seen your companion casually shrug off not that long ago, there was practically no hope for the defenders anyway, so you were essentially just speeding things up. But the prospect of finishing this mess up before the reinforcements could rush in faster than your monster of a knight could kill them was still quite enticing, so you naturally continued to give it your all in hopes that your companion could successfully break through to their leaders. Yet despite your improving mood and outright awesome hunt, you couldn't help but think back on how quickly you two could have finished things up if you had asked the giant spirit about how resistant he was to poisons, as you remembered just how enticing that giant blob of mountain knights had been. Life was life, you supposed. It could have been worse, as you're quite sure that most of the mountain knights currently fighting your companion would have happily traded places with you. And speaking of the mountain knights, it seems like the enemy commanders had managed to send more than just a few scouts, as you suddenly heard the clatter of plate in the distance. It appears that they didn't truly understand the threat your companion posed despite the massive losses they were surely still receiving. Mayhaps the first few tribes of reinforcements you were worried about had been closer than you had expected, if they really thought that they could spare a dozen men in plate. You of course understood that the enemy commanders desperately needed the number of enemies they were truly facing now that they knew for a fact that the woods surrounding them were no longer in their hands. But you really had to wonder if they truly had enough manpower to perform reconnaissance in force with squads of a dozen knights each while the giant spirit was going through who knows how many of these very same knights outside the gate as the minutes continued to fly by. Well, it was not like you really needed to understand the logic behind their decisions to exploit them, so you just silently began following the squad of mountain knights to their destination, wherever that might be. And while the journey southward itself wasn't anything worth talking about, the same couldn't be said about the destination as you found yourself creeping behind some bushes atop a small rock formation going parallel to a great and wide ravine with its own small river. It was all in all quite the beautiful place as the water flowing down from the massive cliff nearby managed to fill the valley with just the right amount of background noise to make the place feel magical. Yet, you swiftly decided to ignore the untainted land around you as the knights continued to march onward, finally revealing why the enemy commanders had sent as much fighting strength as they did for what you believed was quite the simple issue to resolve. For instead of searching for the troops they believed were already hidden in the surrounding woods, they had in reality sent this and the other squads of knights you had heard along the way to secure the paths of their reinforcements. And now that you thought about it, you could see the thoughts behind their moves as if they had been your own, as the plan to use the coming reinforcements to push their imaginary enemy from the woods against the walls and barred gates of their camp became painfully apparent. It wasn't all that surprising, as the mountain clans had gained victory after victory against the powerful hosts of the Vale with their massive encirclements, so why wouldn't they use a strategy revolving around another massive encirclement to beat the nigh unfellable knight and his men? You knew that such a strategy wasn't going to work against your companion as you had the chance to see him run at full speed as well as the sheer durability of his armor. But seeing as it only cost them a few dozen knights to protect these vital, and apparently quite secret suspension bridges, you couldn't help but be impressed with their efforts.